Good morning, church. Hope you're having a good morning today. I hope you're having a good day of worship. Maybe you're enjoying a nice hot cup of coffee this morning. I know I've missed being able to have a cup of joe with each and every one of you on Sunday mornings, and hopefully we'll be able to do that here soon. Yeah. Nothing like a good cup of coffee. Now, the funny thing is, you could have two different kinds of coffee, and one can taste great, and the other one can leave you with this bitter taste in your mouth. You put them through the same cup of coffee. Maybe just say you get your usual cup of coffee. You take the grounds, the brand you always buy, you put it in the machine, flip it on, just like you always do, and get it ready to go. Brews, and then you've got a nice hot cup of coffee. Makes you feel good. Now, there's other times maybe you tried a different brand. Something else was on sale. You saved $2. You thought you were going to try this new coffee brand. Maybe you had a friend or family member say, "Ooh, you got to try this coffee." And you did. You put in the same amount of coffee grounds, the same filter you always use, the same amount of water, the same machine you always use. But it comes out tasting bitter. And just the nastiest thing that is good for nothing other than pouring down the drain. Now, what's the difference? They're both coffee. The circumstances were the same, but that process of that hot water and steam pulling that water through the grounds and into the coffee pot brings out those qualities and flavors from those coffee beans that you couldn't see until they were teased and brought out from those coffee grounds. Stressful circumstances tend to do the same things to us. Whenever the pressure's on, the heat's up, the stress is high, those are the times whenever it brings out things that are maybe hiding below the surface that maybe you didn't know were there. Maybe things you did know that were there, but you wish nobody else knew. Today, we're going to see this same kind of occurrence come up in the life of Moses and the Israelites. A couple weeks ago, we were with Pastor Bethany at the beginning of the book of Exodus whenever God called Moses to go and free his people from Pharaoh. And Moses said, "Who should I say that you are?" And God said, "I am that I am." Last week, we journeyed forward to Exodus 17, and Pastor Bethany shared with us the story whenever Joshua and the Israelites were fighting the Amalekites. And every time that Moses had his arms lifted high, they were winning the battle. But when his arms drooped low from being tired, they would lose. And so people came by, helped his arms up, helped him lifted high. And we talked about God being our banner, the one that we identify by, the one that is our identity, Jehovah Nissi. Well, this week we want to look at God as Jehovah Rapha, my healer. Now, at this point in Exodus, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 15 today. At this point in the story, they've already passed through the Red Sea, and they're on their way through the wilderness, but they haven't quite made it to Mount Sinai, where God will formally establish a covenant relationship with the people. Good things are happening. They've just been liberated from slavery. They walked through a whole sea on dry land. Earlier on in chapter 15, we have the record of a spontaneous praise and worship service breaking out on the eastern shore of the Red Sea. So, by the end of that chapter, God is identifying himself as Jehovah Rapha, God, my healer. What do they need healed of? Things seem to be doing pretty good. Life was good. They were a liberated people. They've been given a fresh start. How do we go from spontaneous praise and worship to needing to be healed? By the end of this time together this morning, I want us to see what that means And I want us to remember, God always reveals himself in the context of his story with us. It's always connected with something. These aren't just random names that God comes up with because they sound really good or they bring out his good qualities. But they always come in context. So we're going to find out what that context is. And we're going to find out what all of this has to do with a good cup of coffee. Give you a moment to turn in your Bibles this morning to Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 to 27. Exodus 15, 22 to 27. We hear these words. Then Moses led Israel to journey away from the Red Sea. They went out to the desert of Shur, walked for 3 days into the desert, and found no water. Then they came to Marah, but they were not able to drink the waters of Marah because they were bitter. That's why its name was Marah. So the people murmured against Moses, saying, "What can we drink?" He cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When Moses threw it into the water became safe to drink. There the Lord made for them a binding ordinance, and there he tested them. He said, "If you will diligently obey the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, and pay attention to his commandments and keep all his statutes, then all the diseases that I brought on the Egyptians I will not bring on you. For I, the Lord, am your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and there they camped by the water. This is the word of the Lord today. Thanks be to God. What an amazing story. They had just been brought out of slavery. And they were just beginning their trek into the desert. For 3 days they walked through the desert, but they couldn't find any water. There were no exits with a McDonald's. There were no rest areas in sight anywhere. Now talk about a hard way to start a long road trip. You've had those times. It's kind of like getting a flat tire and having to stop 3 times for potty breaks for the kids before you've even gotten an hour down the road, trying just to get to your vacation spot at the beach. Now, the people went from walking through the Red Sea where there was nothing but water to a place where they couldn't find water anywhere, not even a small drop to satisfy their thirst. And as you can imagine, as anybody does on a long road trip, the people were starting to get cranky. They were already hot and tired. And now there was nowhere for them to refill their water bottles. Now, the mention of 3 days is not random here in this text. It's an intentional choice. If you remember, if you'll look back in Exodus later on today, to whenever Moses is having one of his standoffs and negotiations with Pharaoh, he asked Pharaoh to allow him to take the people out into the desert take the men of the nation out into the desert for a 3-day journey so that they might go out there to worship their God. Well, here we are, 3 days into the desert. Now, earlier in the chapter, they had their worship service. But now, after that worship service and 3 days of journeying, there wasn't much worshiping going on, but there was a whole lot of grumbling. Something is wrong. Life was good. Their God had totally crushed their enemies. God had brought them out. God was leading them on to the land that he promised them. But their happiness, like so many things trying to grow in the desert, was hot and was withering and fading fast. Verse 23 tells us that they came to Mara, but they were not able to drink the waters because they were bitter. It's like pulling off on your trip and you get to a gas station. You finally find one that doesn't creep you out, doesn't look like it's going to have cockroaches running away from the walls whenever you flip on the light. And you pull up to the tank only to find out they've got bags over all the pumps and none of them work. I can imagine their disappointment. They've been all that way. They've run out of water. They are hot. They are thirsty. And there is no water they can drink. It's there, but it is bitter. They can't drink that. They left slavery. Weren't things supposed to be getting better? It's interesting that the water was bitter. Back in, just as before they began this journey, on that night of the Passover when the death angel was going to be going over all the land. And the Israelites were instructed to prepare a lamb and put the blood of the lamb over the doorpost. And part of that Passover meal that they were going to be eating year after year after year to remind them of what God had done for them was to eat bitter herbs, to remind them of the bitterness of slavery. Because when we get in the midst of hard circumstances, they can seem so much bigger and so much worse than some of the things we've experienced in the past. And sometimes we look back and say, well, that was certainly better than things are now. But God wanted them to remember. And I think it's an important lesson for us to remember when we go through times of hardship, through times of trial, maybe whenever God is using those circumstances to bring some things to the surface. It doesn't help to look back and wish that things could be different. In the midst of all of this, God was going to make an amazing thing happen. That rumble of discontent was starting to grow and starting to get pretty big. If only thinking was abounding and was skewing their memories of life in Egypt. And so they went calm, cool, and collected to voice their concerns to Moses, right? No. Anything but. Like protesters storming a state capitol building, the people went as an angry mob to hurl their bitterness at Moses. Because certainly this was his fault. He was the one representing God, and it was God's fault too. They should have been well taken care of. They murmured. This doesn't sound like a bad word. It just sounds like a funny thing coming out of your mouth. But every resource I looked at this week made sure to mention just how strong a word this is. It's more than just whining and complaining. It's maybe even more than grumbling that things would be better. This was a voice of disapproval. It's like a vote of no confidence in a parliament, saying that the members of that body have lost all confidence in their leader. In this moment, they weren't just grumbling and murmuring against Moses. They were questioning God's abilities and his motives. That's some pretty big stuff. That takes some big courage to stand up to God and let him know that you don't think he's doing a very good job. Now Moses had been with the people this whole way through Egypt, out of Egypt. He had been with them every step of the way. He was hot and thirsty too. His feet were tired, and he was in the same circumstances as everyone else. But he didn't turn to murmur against God. He wasn't grumbling. He hadn't lost faith. Not only was he experiencing the same tidal wave of hardship as everyone else, but now he was enduring all of their bitter insults being hurled at him. Now, Moses didn't respond by joining in with their complaining, well, yeah, God's horrible, he totally botched this thing up. I can't believe he did that. He didn't go to some leader friends of his and say, these people that I have to lead, man, they're just a bunch of losers. I can't believe they would do something like this. No. He went to God. He turned to God in prayer. He couldn't handle this on his own, but he knew that God could. God directed Moses to throw a particular tree into the water. And he did, and it became drinkable. That's pretty amazing. I don't know how that works or why that works, but it did work. The important thing to notice here is that word for direct. When God pointed Moses' direction over to that tree, there in verse 25, when God showed him that tree, that word comes from the same word root that is used for Torah, teaching. That's what the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that's called the Torah, the law, God's instruction for the people. A Jewish rabbi who lived in the latter part of the 1800s and through the first half of the 1900s said Israel needed God's instruction if they were going to enjoy his provisions. Moses did exactly that. He knew the help that he needed, and so he turned to God to learn what he needed to do. Now we've seen the people of Israel and we've seen Moses react in 2 very different ways. Moses was like that good cup of coffee. The circumstances brought out that quality of turning to God whenever the pressure's on and you need help. Turning to God and being open to God's instruction to be shaped and transformed. The Israelites instead grumbled and murmured against Moses and against God. Those circumstances, the heat, the weariness, the stress of the time, brought out of them that quality of bitterness that had been lurking below the surface. Now, this is not to say that their worship of God back there in the beginning of Exodus chapter 15 wasn't genuine. I'm sure it was. They were very thankful people. It didn't mean that they didn't love God less. But some of the circumstances were bringing up some negative things in their lives that needed to be dealt with. In Matthew 12:33-35, we see a similar thing going on. When Jesus was confronting the Pharisees, he told them that words and actions, especially when the pressure is on and the stress level is high, reveal the condition of a person's heart. That a good tree bears good fruit. Bad trees bear bad fruit. And in verse 35, Jesus says, "For the mouth speaks from what fills the heart." So this isn't just an Exodus Old Testament thing. And it's not just a New Testament thing. This is a principle for us to remember that we can apply to our lives. To be honest, the first few times I read through today's passage for the sermon, God's demand for obedience in exchange for avoiding the plagues struck me as odd. When I looked at this passage where this name of God is first used, where Jehovah Rapha first makes its appearance, I expected to see a feel-good story of someone who had been hard up on their luck, struck by disease, or facing circumstances beyond their control, who were rescued by God just in the nick of time. It took some thought, reflection, and prayer, and seeing what maybe some other pastors and scholars had drawn from this passage before God helped me to see what the story is really getting at. In order to heal you, sometimes God uses circumstances to make you aware of your need to be healed. If the Israelites had obeyed God's commands and statutes, then he would not bring the Egyptian plagues on them also. Remember, the Israelites had been spared the loss of their firstborn because they were covered by the blood of the lamb that had been slaughtered for that Passover meal. It wasn't because of their exceptional qualities or their superior morals. It was because God in His grace had covered them with His righteousness to protect them. If they did not learn to trust God and allow God to transform them into Yahweh-centered people, then their bitterness would destroy them from the inside out, just like one of the plagues that had wrecked Egypt. Let that sink in for a minute. God didn't want the remnants of sin in their life to ruin them from the inside out. He didn't want them turning sour and bitter. He wanted to save them from their own self-destruction. God is Jehovah Rapha, our healer. When we walk in obedience, God works a healing transformation in our lives. So the kind of healing that we're talking about isn't so much a physical kind of healing of a disease, a sickness, an illness, some kind of condition, but talking even more so about our attitudes, our spiritual lives, our motives, our behaviors. Healing that brokenness that is caused by sin in our lives. Sin breaks us human beings. Sin causes us to turn just inward on ourselves so that we don't look to God for help, for our salvation, for our healing. And sometimes it's those circumstances that are difficult, things that are trying and hard in our lives that help to bring out some of those things that need healing. Maybe for you it's bitterness. Maybe it's a tendency to anger. Maybe it's ill feelings towards another person. Maybe circumstances might bring up memories of someone who hurt you years back and you thought you had gotten over it, but maybe something happened and it brought it to the surface. Whatever it might be, what are your circumstances revealing about the condition of your heart today? What do you need for God to heal in your life today? Did you see what happened there in that last verse of today's passage? In verse 27, it says, when they came to Elim, somewhere down the road, there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the water. In healing them, they were able to find peace. So what kind of conditions are going on in your life today that are bringing some things to the surface that need to be healed? Will you allow God to do a healing work in you today? Will you pray with me? Lord Jesus, we give you thanks today. God, thank you for speaking into our hearts. God, we want to take this opportunity to open up our hearts to you and allow you to do what you need to do.